The wind howled through the pine trees like a ghost searching for something it lost. Snowflakes drifted across the windows of Eliza Hart's small mountain cabin, melting on the warm glass before they could settle. It was the kind of night that kept people indoors, curled under thick blankets with steaming cups of tea. But Eliza was not most people. She stood barefoot on the wooden floor, a wool blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring at the flickering fireplace, her only company on nights like these. It had been nearly 5 years since she left the city behind. Since the accident. Since the silence had become her companion. She didn't talk about it much, about the child she lost, or the fiancé who left afterward, unable to bear the weight of grief. The mountains offered no judgment, no shallow comfort. Just solitude. And that was enough, most of the time. Until the sound came. At first, she thought it was the wind. A soft, rhythmic whimper, barely louder than the creaking of the old cabin. But then it came again, longer this time, broken, desperate. A cry. Not human. Something young. Eliza's heart skipped. She stepped toward the door, her bare feet cold against the wood. She reached for the heavy coat hanging on the hook and slipped on her boots, fingers trembling more from instinct than fear. A flashlight from the shelf. A worn rifle from behind the door. Just in case. She stepped out into the snow. The forest was dark and full of shadows that twisted under her light. The trees loomed tall, their branches heavy with snow. She followed the sound, crunching over the frozen ground, her breath visible in the cold air. Closer. Closer. And then she saw it. At the base of an old cedar stump, tangled in rusted wire, was a bear cub. Tiny. Barely alive. Its fur was soaked and matted with blood. One leg twisted unnaturally. The wire trap, old, likely illegal, had chewed deep into its flesh. Its eyes blinked slowly, glazed with pain, but they locked onto hers, not with wildness, but a terrifying, desperate trust. Oh my God! Eliza dropped to her knees. For a moment, she froze. What could she do? Call wildlife rescue? But the nearest ranger station was 3 hours away, and the road was impassable. It was tonight or never. The cub let out a low, pitiful whine. Okay, baby. I got you, she whispered. Her breath fogged the air as she fumbled to cut the wire with her multi-tool. The cub didn't fight. It barely moved, save for a twitch every time the metal tugged at its wound. Once free, she wrapped it in her coat and cradled it to her chest. The little heartbeat fluttered like a bird's. She could feel its warmth bleeding into her, weak but present. She staggered back through the snow, every step a fight against wind and fear. Inside, she laid the cub gently near the fireplace on a folded blanket. She tended its wound with trembling hands, cleaned the blood, dressed the injury with strips torn from an old shirt. It didn't growl. It didn't bite. It just watched her. Silently. She fed it drops of warm water with a spoon, then placed another blanket over it, whispering, "You're going to be okay, little one. I promise." Outside, the storm howled louder, but inside the cabin, something softer stirred. Eliza hadn't held a life in years, not since the one she couldn't save. But tonight, cradling that dying bear cub in the firelight, something cracked open in her. A flicker of purpose. A heartbeat of hope. She didn't know it yet. But that night, that choice, would change everything. And years later, when the cub returned, bloodied and full-grown, she would realize just how much. The cub survived the night. Eliza hadn't expected it to. She had sat beside the fire all night long, barely blinking, listening to every shift in the little creature's breathing, shallow, strained, but miraculously steady. She kept warm towels by its side, fed it broth drop by drop, and sang softly when its eyes fluttered open in pain. It was instinctive, not planned. A lullaby she used to hum to her baby. A melody she never thought she'd sing again. The morning arrived pale and cold, snow still falling in thin curtains outside. But inside the cabin, a new warmth had taken root. The cub stirred, groggy, confused, and clearly in pain, but alive. Its small black eyes flicked open and found Eliza kneeling beside it again. A low, uncertain grunt escaped its throat, and it tried to stand. But the moment its paw touched the floor, it whimpered and collapsed again. "No, no, no," Eliza murmured gently. "You've got to rest. We've got time." And they did. That week, the snow never let up. The roads remained blocked. There was no cell signal, no chance of calling the rangers. She was truly alone with the cub, and that forced a decision. She had two choices: do nothing and let nature take its course, or fight for a life that wasn't hers to keep. She chose to fight. She dug out an old dog crate from the barn, layered it with bedding, and moved the cub inside. She created a space by the fire where it could stay warm. She studied every page of a wildlife field guide she'd found years ago, reading about bear diets, behavior, growth stages. She cooked a mixture of goat's milk, honey, and egg yolks, feeding the cub with a dropper until it could eat soft fruit and oatmeal mash on its own. And slowly, day by day, it began to heal. Eliza watched the transformation with a quiet kind of awe. Its fur regained its sheen. Its eyes grew more alert. And despite her efforts to stay detached, to remember this was a wild animal, something else began to bloom between them. A bond. She named him Kai, after the native word for willow tree, the only plant still visible near her cabin despite the snow. Kai followed her eyes everywhere. He would whimper softly if she left the room, even for a moment. When she sat by the fire, he would hobble over with his bandaged leg and curl beside her feet, pressing his body close to hers. And each time she laid a hand on his fur, a sense of calm settled in her chest. He was just a cub, but he filled a space in her that had been empty far too long. The strangest part? He never tried to bite or scratch. He never snarled or roared. He just watched her, with quiet, intelligent eyes that didn't feel like an animal's at all. It was as if something in him understood. That she'd saved him. That she, too, was wounded. By spring, the snow had begun to melt. Patches of grass peeked through the slush. Eliza began letting Kai wander outside a few minutes at a time, always supervised. His leg was healing, slower than it should, but healing, and he needed to regain strength. The forest was waking up again, full of bird calls and trickling water. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't. Not with Kai beside her. One afternoon, as she was refilling the water dish near the porch, a shadow passed overhead. She looked up and froze. A drone. It buzzed briefly, then zipped away, back toward town, no doubt. Someone had been scouting the area. Possibly wildlife services. Possibly hunters. Fear prickled her skin. She hadn't meant to hide the cub. It had just happened. The storm, the timing, the silence. And by the time help had become available again, she hadn't been able to let go. What if they took him away now? Would they lock him in a cage? Ship him off to some facility where he'd never see the sky again? That night, she stayed awake staring at the fire, Kai curled beside her, dreaming with tiny bear twitches. She knew what she had to do. She would prepare him for the wild, slowly, properly, and one day let him go. But on her terms. With love. With dignity. Not through fear or force. Kai wasn't just an animal she had rescued. He was the last chapter of her healing. And maybe, just maybe, she was the first chapter of his wild future. By the end of spring, Kai wasn't just walking, he was running. What had once been a fragile, whimpering cub was now bounding through the trees with a clumsy sort of joy, his thickening fur glinting gold-brown in the sunlight. His limp had lessened, his eyes had brightened, and every new day brought more strength to his once broken leg. Eliza had begun letting him explore the woods near her cabin under careful supervision. He would sniff everything, tree bark, moss, even the boots she left by the door. He discovered bees and tried to eat one, yelping in confusion. He climbed halfway up a birch tree and got stuck, growling until she coaxed him down with berries. And when he found her vegetable garden for the first time, he gave the cabbage a sniff, then sneezed and rolled in the dirt instead. They had developed a routine. Mornings began with Kai pawing at the door until she opened it, where he'd stand up and sniff her face like a dog. She'd laugh, rub behind his ears, and feed him. He had grown to love blueberries and warm oatmeal, and though she tried hard to keep him from getting too used to being fed, he seemed more interested in her company than the food. In the afternoons, they walked. At first, it had just been short trips, down to the riverbank or through the cedar grove nearby. But soon, their walks extended deeper into the forest. And always, Kai stayed close. Even when he wandered ahead, he'd glance back every few steps to make sure she was still coming. She didn't speak during those walks. But sometimes she'd hum. The same tune she'd sung when he was sick. And every time she did, he would stop whatever he was doing and sit beside her quietly. It was like he remembered. And in a way, so did she. She remembered what it felt like to care for something. To trust. To feel needed. The pain of losing her husband and child had silenced her heart for years, but somehow, Kai had cracked that silence open again. News of the bear spread, eventually. Not by her, she never told a soul. But neighbors saw the footprints. A ranger spotted a trail camera image of a young bear with what looked like a healed leg injury. And in a small mountain town like Hollow Creek, word spreads like wind through pine trees. Some came to her door, gently curious, others accusatory. "You can't raise a bear like a pet," one man barked. "I'm not," Eliza said, keeping her voice calm. "He's not mine. He's just not ready yet." But the pressure began building. The state had strict policies about wildlife rehabilitation, and she wasn't officially registered. If anyone reported her, Kai would be tranquilized and relocated. At best. At worst, well, some bears never left captivity again. Eliza knew the day was coming. The day she'd have to let him go. But how do you say goodbye to the one creature who gave you your heart back? She began training him, gently but intentionally. She stopped feeding him by hand and hid his food instead. She taught him to climb, to dig, to sniff out edible roots and berries. She even set up old beehives near the edge of the forest to tempt his instincts into waking. And slowly, Kai began to act less like a dependent cub, and more like a bear. But even as his wildness grew, he never stopped returning. Each night, as dusk fell over the trees and the sky turned purple, Kai would appear. Quiet. Watchful. He'd sit at the edge of the woods and wait until she stepped outside. She'd lift a hand. He'd huff softly and disappear again into the shadows. It became their ritual. A silent agreement. "I'm still here," he seemed to say. "I know," she whispered each time. "So am I." Then one evening, just before summer ended, Kai didn't show up. Eliza waited for hours, flashlight in hand, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She called softly. She left his favorite fruit near the stump he liked. But nothing stirred in the trees. The next night, she waited again. Still nothing. And by the third night, a sharp chill of fear had settled in her bones. Had he moved on? Had someone taken him? Or had something far worse happened to the bear she had raised like her own child? For the first time in nearly a year, the woods were silent. No rustling at the edge of the clearing. No heavy paws brushing through the leaves. No soft huff announcing his arrival. Kai was gone. Eliza didn't panic the first night. Bears wandered. It was natural. She told herself he'd return in the morning, maybe with dirt on his nose from foraging or burrs in his fur from rolling through the underbrush. But he didn't. And by the second night, unease had bloomed into a cold pit in her stomach. She tried to stay rational. He's growing up. He's doing what wild animals are meant to do. But in her heart, something felt wrong. This wasn't like him. Even when he'd spent full days roaming deeper into the forest, he always returned. Always. He never missed their silent evening exchange. Not once. By the third day, Eliza began searching. She followed the paths they used to walk, leaving pieces of fruit and scraps of fabric with her scent along the way. She checked the grove where he first climbed a tree, the riverbank where he once tried to catch trout, even the sun-bleached log where he'd sunbathed every afternoon in spring. Nothing. No paw prints. No broken twigs. No signs of digging or nesting. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole. She called her old friend Arlo, a retired wildlife tracker from across the ridge. He'd helped her once when a wounded fox had been stuck in her shed. "You're sure he didn't just move on?" Arlo asked, brushing snow off his boots as he stepped into her cabin. "Bears don't just vanish like ghosts," she replied. "Not without a sign." Arlo agreed to search the next day. But what he found chilled Eliza to the core. Half a mile from the ridge's edge, near a hollow tree they had once used as shelter, Arlo spotted something dark matted into the snow. Blood. A lot of it. Paw prints, too, fresh, large and wild. Kai's. And something else. Boot tracks. 2 sets. Heading straight toward the place the blood pooled thickest. Arlo crouched over the disturbed snow. His brow furrowed. "He was in a fight," he murmured. "And someone was here after it happened." "Poachers?" Eliza asked, Heart-pounding. Could be. Or something worse. He didn't elaborate, but she could see it in his eyes. He was thinking the same thing she was. Someone might have taken Kai. Or hunted him. Or worse, hurt him and left him to die alone. That night, Eliza didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, a cup of untouched tea in her hands, the warmth long gone. Her eyes burned from crying, her chest tight from panic. The cabin, once filled with the sounds of Kai's playful growls and paw steps, felt impossibly empty. A dozen times she reached for the radio, wanting to call the local authorities. But what would she say? A bear I raised has disappeared, and I think someone's taken him? She didn't have proof. And even if she did, Kai was a wild animal. Legally, she had no claim to him. No one would launch a search party for a bear, no matter how tame or loved he was. Still, she couldn't let it go. He was hers. And if something had happened to him, if someone had hurt him after everything they'd been through together, she would find out. 2 days later, a storm swept through the mountains. Trees groaned under the wind. Snow blanketed the trail. Search was impossible. Eliza paced, restless. Her cabin walls felt too close, too quiet. But just before midnight, as the wind howled outside and the moon broke through the clouds, a sound made her freeze. A thump. Low. Heavy. Like something large dragging itself across the porch. She stood up slowly, heart hammering. A shadow moved past the frosted window. Then another thud, closer this time. She grabbed her lantern and opened the door. What she saw made her gasp. Kai. But this wasn't the strong, playful bear she knew. He was slumped against the cabin wall, breathing heavily. Blood stained his shoulder. More dripped from his side. His fur was caked in mud and snow. One of his ears was torn. His eyes, once bright and curious, were glazed with pain. Kai, she whispered, falling to her knees. Oh my God. He tried to lift his head, tried to huff the way he always did when he saw her. But he collapsed again. Someone, had nearly killed him. And now he had dragged himself home. To her. The storm outside raged for 2 more days, locking Eliza and Kai inside the cabin together, just like it had during the winter of his rescue. But this time, the circumstances were far darker. Kai was barely conscious. His side was torn open in a jagged wound that oozed blood. Something or someone had injured him deeply. Eliza's hands trembled as she cleaned the gash with warm saline. He flinched but didn't fight. That scared her even more. The bear she'd raised had once been a ball of energy. Now, he barely moved. She used the emergency kit she kept for dogs and goats, clean gauze, wound sealant, antibiotics. Anything she could find. She sat beside him for hours, whispering softly the way she had when he was a cub. I've got you, she murmured. You're home now. You're safe. Kai opened his eyes, just barely, and let out a low rumble, part pain, part recognition. It wasn't much. But it was enough. When the storm finally passed, Eliza stepped outside, exhausted and frantic. Arlo had radioed once during the blizzard, but the line had cut out. Now she needed him more than ever. He arrived within the hour. He came back. Arlo asked, stunned, as he approached the porch and saw the blood-stained fur through the window. Yes. But he's hurt bad. Someone did this. Arlo crouched beside Kai, inspecting the wound. This isn't from another animal, he said after a long silence. This is a knife wound. Eliza's stomach sank. Someone attacked him? Looks that way. Deep laceration. Almost surgical. Arlo looked up, his face hard. He didn't just survive the attack, he escaped it. And came back to you. Eliza's cabin wasn't safe anymore. They made a quick decision, move Kai to her reinforced barn. There he'd have shelter, warmth, and space. Arlo and his old ranger contacts helped discreetly. No officials. No noise. Just trust. But that wasn't enough for Eliza. She needed to know what happened. She retraced Kai's path through the forest, returning to the blood-stained snow Arlo had found days ago. There, she discovered something chilling. Boot prints. At least 2 sets. One heavy, one narrow. Human. Leading west toward a hunting trail, off-limits and long abandoned. As she followed the trail deeper into the woods, something caught her eye, a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. Camo. Fresh. Not far from there, she found a small makeshift camp. A tarp. Empty food cans. Boot imprints. And something else. A bear trap, sprung. Blood on the metal. And beside it, a small knife. Serrated. Still stained. Someone had been poaching. And Kai had walked right into it. Eliza returned to the cabin and called Arlo. They tried to kill him. Arlo listened as she told him everything. His face grew darker with every word. I know who it might be, he finally said. There've been rumors of illegal hunters using the old ridge paths, trying to trap meat for profit. But no one's caught them. I need names, Eliza said coldly. Even if we had them, there's no way to prove they hurt Kai. She looked down at her bear, still lying in the barn, breathing slow but alive. Then we wait. That night, Eliza sat by Kai's side, thinking of all the moments they had shared, his first snowfall, the way he chased falling leaves, how he once curled up with her old dog on the porch like a child needing comfort. He'd been more than just a rescued animal. He was family. Now, someone had tried to take him from her. She would find them. And she would make sure they never hurt another creature again. By the next morning, Kai was stronger. He lifted his head, nudged Eliza's hand, and let out a soft huff. You're not done, are you? She whispered, stroking his fur. Good. Because neither am I. Spring returned to the valley with soft winds, wildflowers blooming along the edge of Eliza's land, and the melting snow revealing trails once hidden. But something inside Eliza had changed forever. It had been weeks since Kai had stumbled back into her life, bleeding, broken, but alive. Now, he was strong again. The wound on his side had closed into a long scar, the fur slowly regrowing over it. His eyes, once dulled by pain, now held the same fierce glow of survival he had as a cub. He didn't stay in the barn anymore. Every morning, he would rise before dawn and disappear into the forest. Every evening he would return, quietly, always before dark, and settle at the edge of her porch, just as he had in the old days. It became their ritual once more. But something was different now. This time, he wasn't just a bear she'd saved. He was a protector. One evening, Eliza and Arlo sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the tree-line. Kai lay nearby in the grass, massive and peaceful. He's waiting for something, Arlo said, sipping from a chipped mug. Eliza nodded. So am I. The poachers were still out there. They hadn't returned, not yet. But the blood-stained trap, the boot prints, and the knife were evidence enough. They would come back. And when they did, Kai would be ready. A week later, they did. It was just past midnight when Eliza's motion cameras caught movement at the northern edge of her land. Two shadowy figures moved fast, trying to avoid detection. Eliza didn't panic. She walked outside calm, quiet, and gave a single soft whistle. There was a rustle in the trees. And then Kai appeared. Not just Kai. Two more bears. Massive, silent, wild. But they stood with him. Just behind him. Watching her. Waiting. Eliza didn't flinch. She recognized the one with a scar above his eye. Another with a distinctive light patch on her chest. Kai's siblings. The ones from the sanctuary. They were together again. The poachers didn't make it far. When they reached the clearing near Eliza's cabin, they were greeted by three full-grown bears standing in silence, side by side. No roaring. No lunging. Just presence. That was enough. The men froze. One dropped a bag. Another reached for something at his hip, too slow. Kai stepped forward. Not attacking, just standing tall. Dominant. Commanding. A warning. And the men ran. Arlo, already stationed nearby with his drone and wildlife camera, got everything on video. By dawn, the authorities had the footage, the evidence, and the coordinates. The poachers were tracked, arrested, and charged not only with illegal hunting, but with assault on a protected animal. News of the guardian bears of Pine Hollow spread like wildfire. But Eliza kept quiet. To her, it wasn't about justice or recognition. It was about Kai. About what they had built together. He had returned, wounded, desperate, not just for healing, but to protect her too. He hadn't come alone. Weeks passed. Spring deepened. Wild berries grew thick along the trails. The wind warmed. Kai stayed close, but less frequently. He came every few days now. Sometimes with his siblings, sometimes alone. One morning, he didn't come at all. Or the next. Eliza knew. He was ready. She stood at the edge of the forest, holding a small woven pendant she had made from his baby collar, a remnant from the earliest days of his rescue. She placed it on the stump by the old barn, where the sun always hit first. A gift. A goodbye. "I'll always be your forest," she whispered, eyes misting. Behind her, the wind rustled the trees, like a response. She didn't cry. Not this time. Because Kai hadn't left her. Not really. That fall, hikers in the ridge country began reporting sightings of 3 large bears, moving together, peacefully, never aggressive. Local rangers noted they never approached campsites or homes. But one story stood out. A camper who had broken her leg during a solo trek swore a bear had sat nearby all night, keeping watch, keeping predators away, until help arrived in the morning. Arlo smiled when he heard it. Eliza just said, he always did know who needed him. Eliza still lives in the cabin on Pine Hollow Road. She keeps fresh water by the stream. A few apples near the stump. And every so often, they're gone by morning. On those days, she smiles wider, walks a little lighter, and drinks her tea with the sense that someone strong is watching. From the shadows. Still her bear. Still her heart.